Thank you. I decided years ago that if 10 people show up, I'm grateful. If 20 people show up, I'm ecstatic. I don't know what to do with this group here, so I'll just say thank you for coming to this. I feel deeply honored. And I appreciated the honor that was given to the founder of this lecture, too. That, to me, is a beautiful thing. And I love seeing Whitworth alums out here, too, and I see a bunch of them, and that brings great satisfaction to me. Your professor, your professor introduced you to photography. I introduced my students to home beer brewing. I hope, I'm only kidding. No filters, no filters. If you've seen the recent film, that's, what is that, playbook? Silver Linings Playbook. No filters comes through in that a lot. Well, here I am. I'm standing before a group of psychologists, psychology professors and students and therapists and other types who care deeply about human nature and the health of the human person. But I'm not one of your kind. As you probably know, I make my living as a church historian, not as a psychologist, so I'm going to try to bring those two worlds together as best I can, and I appreciate the fact that you've invited an outsider to the field to deliver this lecture. My knowledge of psychology is somewhat limited, I'll have to admit. Many years ago, I viewed a video of Carl Rogers in action, and that definitely helped to turn me in the direction of creed and confession and canon, where I could ground my beliefs on the sturdy foundation of absolutes. When I was in graduate school, I read Sigmund Freud quite a bit, which only made me grateful for the many healthy and happy friends I had there and still have to this day. I wonder what would have happened to Freud if he had taught at Wheaton or Whitworth in his early formative years. And yes, I've watched Dr. Phil and Oprah on occasion on TV, and so I've tried to think positive thoughts about my life. That's about the extent of my knowledge about psychology. I did, however, marry a therapist 2.5 years ago, and that really doesn't qualify me much for the field, but it's interesting to be married to someone who makes her living in the profession that some of you do or are preparing to do. She gets to practice on me every day, and she says that I've become her favorite client. I feel very good about that. But in all seriousness, I think we have more in common than is immediately apparent considering our disciplines. I teach church history, which tells the story about how real people have tried in their own place and time to find health and holiness in God as we know Him as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Of course, you're interested in the same thing. That's just kind of the Christian thing to do. You simply have a different angle of vision. And I really consider it my calling in life to be a kind of rehabilitator of the past, to be a good historian, to be accurate, to be fair, but to give history a voice, to speak into our lives, and to enlarge our perspective. So accuracy and usability are two words that I inform how I do my work. Well, this morning or this afternoon, I'm going to function as an historian, and in that capacity, introduce you to a person about whom you know little or nothing. I want to bring him to your attention because he is a psychologist of sorts, and thus functioned as your counterpart some 1,600 years ago. He was interested in many of the same questions that you have. His perspective, obviously, is going to be different, as one would expect living so long ago. Needless to say, he was not always right in what he said, at least not entirely. Then again, we're not always right either, are we? C.S. Lewis once wrote that reading old books and studying figures from the past might spare us from becoming a prisoner to our own age. Where we went wrong has long been, or where they went wrong has long been obvious. Where they were right might protect us from going wrong in the opposite direction. He writes in this lovely little introduction to Athanasius' On the Incarnation, The only palliative is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds. What a lovely phrase. The clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds. And this can be done only by reading old books, or I could add, listening to lectures about really old people, which is what we're going to do today. Now, John Cassian was a desert father, though there were desert mothers too, as we well know. I want to tell his story very briefly and then explore the ideas that make him such a provocative and, I hope, useful psychologist. Cassian grew up in the Baltics, but left his native land when he was in his 20s, being lured to the eastern Mediterranean by strange stories he heard about the desert fathers and mothers. Cassian and his traveling companion, Germanus, settled into a monastery in Bethlehem for a while, but soon grew restless to move on and meet the masters of the movement who resided in the deserts of Egypt. So try to use your imagination here as he migrates from the Baltics, lives in a monastery for a while, and then makes his way to the deserts of Egypt. Receiving permission to leave the monastery, they traveled to Egypt and visited places where the desert fathers and mothers lived and thrived. There they stayed for 7 years, returning only once to Bethlehem to report on what they had seen and heard. Forced out of Egypt around the year 400, they fled for protection to Constantinople, then the capital of the Eastern Empire, where they met the famous patriarch John Chrysostom. His nickname, by the way, is Chrysostom. It means golden mouth. Where they were dazzled by his preaching and impressed by his spiritual and moral vigor, and he ordained them to church office. A few years later, Chrysostom too fell into trouble, so Germanus and Cassian traveled to Rome on Chrysostom's behalf to seek the aid of the Pope. His name was Innocent I. Innocent eventually ordained Cassian as a priest. Cassian then left for Marseille in Gaul and helped to found 2 monasteries there. He also wrote 2 important books on Egyptian monasticism because a local bishop asked him. He wanted literature that would help the Western Church begin to imitate the excellence of the monastic life in Egypt. So that's what Cassian did. He got involved in a bunch of other controversies while he was there, and he died sometime in the early 430s. Now, already in Cassian's day, Egypt had earned a reputation as the place where desert spirituality had reached its pinnacle of power and influence. The reputed founder of the movement, Abba Antony, was already becoming a household name, and various sayings of masters like Antony were being circulated around the Mediterranean world. The word desert immediately brings to mind visions of barrenness, isolation, deprivation, hardship. In Cassian's day, however, the stories of the desert fathers and mothers had turned the desert into a metaphor for humility, wisdom, discipline, power, as if these masters had withdrawn into the most inhospitable place on earth and created a new kind of Eden. Though outsiders to the larger culture, they had really become insiders to influence and reputation. Now, he wrote 2 books, as I said before. His Institutes, the shorter of the 2, describe the life of the monks in the deserts of Egypt. Talks about their schedule, their clothing, their practices, and the like. And then in the last 8 chapters, describe the 8 deadly thoughts or vices. We'll return to those. The Conferences, much longer book, explores the teachings of a dozen, 15 or so masters of the desert and focuses on topics like discretion, purity of heart, prayer, and the like. Now, there is much that we could explore in his writing. It is utterly fascinating. But I want to concentrate on only one, the battle for the heart. The Egyptian masters taught Cassian that the Christian life demands struggle. The fallenness of the world, say sickness or mental anguish, the perversity of human nature, And the call of discipleship thrust us into this life of struggle, whether we like it or not. And the sayings of the Desert Fathers describe these kinds of struggles on almost every page. We might try to avoid it, but eventually it will have its way with us, this struggle. For this is one battle we simply cannot escape. So we might as well face it squarely, especially as it manifests itself in the human heart. As Abba Antony taught, one of my favorite quotes from the Desert Fathers, "The man who abides in solitude and is quiet is delivered from fighting 3 battles, those of hearing, speech, and sight. Then he will have but one battle left to fight, the battle of the heart." John Cassian put it this way, "No one is more my enemy than my own heart, which is truly the one of my household closest to me." So I want to describe this battle of the heart using Cassian's description of the 8 deadly vices. And then I'm going to show the way out that Cassian prescribes. Now, what did Cassian mean by the 8 deadly vices or sins as we know it today? The 7 deadly sins, of course, is much more popularly known. That was actually crafted, developed by Gregory the Great about 150 years later. But the words like vice or sin are not quite right, for they tend to connote bad behavior. Vice manifests itself as bad habits. Sin is something we do. But as we all well know, sin has as much to do with the mind as it does with behavior. Cassian studied under the Egyptian master Evagrius Ponticus, who died in 399. And Evagrius used the word logismos instead of vice or sin to plummet the depths of the human condition. And this word is very rich and complex. Now, it could be translated reason or thought, but the real meaning is more subtle than that. Evagrius did not have a passing thought in mind here, the kind that flashes across the screen of the mind at a pace that leaves no trace in the memory, or reason as if you're adding 2 + 2 = 4. Instead, he had in mind the kind of thought that dominates the mind. Thus, a word like calculation or reflection is closer to its meaning, as well as sentiment or imagination. Even sometimes Evagrius will use the word fantasy. Such a thought takes up residence in the mind and eventually inhabits it, driving out all others. You know what I mean, don't you? Your mind gets preoccupied with it and it just fills the entire space. That's what Evagrius Ponticus and Cassian had in mind. Now, Cassian outlines the 8 deadly vices in order of danger and severity, from the least deadly to the most deadly, although, as we can well guess, they're all deadly. The order follows a certain kind of logic, too. The first group of 3 involves some form of external stimulation. The second group, we call that a temptation. The second group of 3 consists of internal struggles. The final 2 afflict us when we appear to be at our strongest and best. And they are, in the end, the deadliest of all. All right, I'm going to go through all 8 quite briefly. And if you feel increasingly uneasy as this lecture goes on, then that means the Holy Spirit is at work in your heart. Gluttony. The problem with gluttony, says Cassian, is that it is ever present as a temptation because we never outgrow our need for food. Gluttony thus consists of preoccupation with food, craving for food, even fussiness about food. Both the need for food and the pleasure of it drive us to think about it and then overindulge when it's in front of us. Cassian believes that overcoming gluttony is the first battle we must fight in the spiritual life, for food is always with us. It is the foothills of the spiritual quest, not the summit. He is surprisingly flexible in the disciplines he prescribes, such as fasting, for example. That would be the most obvious, right? You fast to overcome gluttony. Well, not exactly. The antidote, he argues, is restraint. even as we eat. The right balance is moderation, not satiation. Gratitude, not pickiness. And thus, I quote, even while still desiring it, we approach with restraint the food that we are obliged to eat in order to sustain our lives. Approach with restraint. Thus, he allows monks to break their fasts if company arrives. He's very generous when it comes to that. And to vary their fasts lest they become legalistic and fanatical. If anything, fasting only exposes the problem. Fasting cannot remedy it. Only God can do that. So Cassian concludes this way in another book. True fasting is eating just a little less than what we want. Isn't that lovely? Well, maybe it's not lovely now that I think of it. That is the essence of restraint, a little less than what we want. All right, that's gluttony. Fornication. This, Cassian writes, is a savage war that requires incredible discipline of the mind, and even then victory will always elude us without God's help. Now remember, he's writing to monks. Keep that in mind. No techniques of self-control can match the power of this vice. I quote, "For the soul cannot escape being attacked by this vice until it realizes that waging this war is beyond its own powers and that it cannot obtain the victory by its own toil and effort without the assistance and protection of the Lord." If gluttony poses a problem because we always have to eat, fornication poses a problem because it appeals to longings deeply rooted in human biology. Remember, he's writing to monks. We are especially vulnerable to this fantasy at night when we face the problem of, his words, nocturnal emissions. Imagine a monk writing about this in the 5th century. At this point, Cassian is a realist. He concedes that monks must allow nature to take its course, which will occur, he says, about once a month for younger monks, less often for older monks. But he is quick to add that monks exacerbate the problem by fantasizing about fornication during the day, for then day flows into night. The real problem is mental images, not the temptation itself, which all of us face in some shape or form. The mind seizes upon temptation and indulges in fantasy, which leads to corruption of the soul. It is this battle that we must fight. How relevant to people who struggle with addiction, say like pornography. Avarice, or love of money. Some vices, Cassian notes, are derivatives of a natural impulse, which can actually be good if the natural impulse is expressed properly. Cassian puts both anger and sadness in that category, as we'll see. Those are natural things. We all feel that way. Every human being feels anger and sadness for legitimate reasons. Our task, he says, is to keep it from turning into a vice. But avarice is different. It is not rooted in a natural impulse. It has nothing to do with real needs and legitimate wants. The problem with avarice is not that we want or need something, it is that we keep wanting more no matter how much we have. Always more. More wealth, more success, more power. Thus, enough never ends up being enough. It finds ready excuses too, the insecurity of old age, or the unpredictability of life, or the unfairness of the world. The consequences of this vice are especially destructive to community, he says. Avarice undermines generosity. Just as an aside, the Atlantic Monthly in their most recent edition had an article on why the richest people in the United States are the least generous percentage-wise. Top 20% give an average of 1.3% of their income a year to all charitable causes. 1.3%. Avarice undermines generosity, causes worry, drives us to make foolish decisions, turns every activity into a competition, and engenders envy of the success of others. Poverty is no cure. Neither is wealth, no matter how much you have. The best discipline is, his line, to give something up, which is Cassian's way of saying to go beyond, to give beyond our means or our level of comfort, and thus to wean ourselves from excessive attachment to the craving for more. Anger. This is the first of three vices manifesting largely internal struggles, though they are stirred up by outward problems and disappointments. Cassian assures us that anger is natural and can even be good. God gets angry, he says, and so should we at ourselves. That is, at our sin and selfishness, at the corruption of the human heart. In fact, it is at night that we should get angry, contemplate our own sin and repent of it, and then meditate on the goodness and grace of God. I quote Psalm 4, "Be angry, but sin not. Commune with your own hearts on your bed, and be silent. Offer right sacrifices, and put your trust in the Lord." But the vice of anger is different. It is awakened when we think about the unfairness of life, the wounds that we have unjustly received, the wrongs done to us by others. Yet we refuse to admit the problem, own up to it, and confess it. Instead, we hide our anger, and when questioned about it, claim that we are not angry, often saying defensively, "What do you mean? I'm not angry. I didn't do anything. Stop being so picky." Avarice Ponticus describes anger as a boiling over until it spills poison everywhere. Cassian actually prefers a different metaphor, more akin to a low simmering which keeps the poison in the pot.